Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow, and today we are going to be getting into signal flow. We're going to cover some of the basics of signal flow and how it applies to production and songwriting. The general gist of signal flow is getting the signal to go from where it is to where you want it to be, and then to process it the way you want it to be processed, whether that's EQ, compression, reverb, delay, etc., all the above. So we're going to start with an acronym. Now, this is going to be probably more on the recording or engineering side of things, but understanding signal flow will definitely help you to understand kind of how you can process signals and route them in ways that will up your game in production. This is a little bit more advanced, but we're going to be starting with the absolute basics. And so we're going to come over here and we have this acronym. It says A1 opium. That's just an easy way to remember it. But how that breaks down is the A stands for assign. The 1 is actually an I, and that's going to be for input. The O is going to be output. So assign, you want to tell the signal, whatever it is, if it's a vocal, for instance, and you're singing into a microphone, you want to assign that microphone an input and an output. You want to set your preamp or gain. And then you want to tell it to go to your monitor and your master. So we're going to dig into this pretty quick. And we're just going to go, the A1 opium is just basically an easy acronym so that you can remember this basic signal flow chart. This is how it was taught to me. And if you can understand this, you can operate any mixing board, any DAW, and it'll all make sense with a little bit of time and patience. So assign, we want to tell the signal where we want to go. And we do that by telling it to go to its inputs and outputs. So for instance, if we come down here, let's say that we have a microphone. We want to send that microphone into a cable. That's basically outputting. The input would be your vocal in this particular instance. All right. So you have a singer and they're singing into a microphone. That is input number 1. And signal flow is all about the chain of input and outputs. Okay. So you can think of this vocal is being input into the microphone. The microphone then is being output into a cable. That cable is then being output into, say, your mixer or your interface. Okay, and this is a very simple kind of thing, but as you can see here, you've got the output of the vocal going into the input of this mic. And then it happens again. You've got the output of the mic going to the input of the cable. Then you have the output of the cable going to the input of the mixer or the interface or whatever you happen to be going into, right? And so you can see that this is kind of a series of inputs and outputs, inputs and outputs. And, you know, your vocal is the input, right? So I'm hoping this all makes sense. This is probably the best I can do as far as a visual representation without becoming an expert in like graphic design and drawing all this kind of stuff out. But hopefully this is kind of a visual representation of how this works, right? So you're assigning your inputs. In this case, the vocal, you're assigning to the input of the microphone, which makes sense. And then you're assigning the output of that microphone to the input of that cable. You're assigning the output of that cable to the input of the mixer, the interface, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll give you a a better example of this when we look at our DAW and see how this kind of all works out, right? But suffice to say, we're setting and assigning our inputs and outputs. Next, we're going to look at our preamp. So and preamp is another way for gain. You're going to be setting your gain or your preamp to boost the signal. So if you have a microphone, somewhere on your interface or your board, your mixer, what have you, there's going to be a gain or a preamp knob, and you're going to turn that up, and all of a sudden you're going to be able to see signal. If there's a visual representation, usually there's some sort of visual representation showing you that there's a level coming in. When the vocalist sings, you'll see lights kind of flash up on the board, etc. Not all boards or interfaces will necessarily have this, so we then need to make sure that that signal is coming through both on our monitor and our master. So you can think of the monitor as what you are hearing and the master as what your computer is hearing, in the case of like recording to a DAW. So monitor is what you are hearing, the master is what the computer is hearing in this particular instance, right? So the output of this mixer interface would be going into your computer or DAW. There we go. And DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation, and that's your software component. That's your Pro Tools, your Ableton, your Fruity Loops, your Reason, GarageBand, whatever you're using. They're all great. They're all going to do pretty much the same thing, and so you don't have to worry about what you're using too much. It's more important that you know how to use it than what you're using. If you're using Pro Tools and you know how to use it, that's great. Keep it up. But Pro Tools is not necessarily the best. It's only the best if it works the best for you. If you use Ableton, keep using Ableton. If you know how to make it work, that's the important thing. It's not what you're using, it's how you use what you're using. So I hope this is a very simplified version of signal flow, but once you understand this, you can understand basically how to run any board or get signal to come in through into your DAW. All right. So we'll get a look at our DAW here real quick. We'll just delete this for now. And then we are going to bring up a console view here. Now there's not much to see right now because we don't really have anything set up except for a master and a metronome, which we can move off to the side for now. But if we want to insert an audio track, we get this to come up, right? Now this is emulating, and all DAWs have this. This is basically just emulating what a hardware component or a hardware mixer or console would be doing, right? So you have your gain up here at the top, your preamp, and then you have some other things. You have you can set up some aux tracks. You have your mutes, your solos, your records, things like this. And then you have your volume fader, and then you have your pan. So you also need to assign this channel as well. So if we were to, this is just the way I'm familiar with it, but you have your input here and your output here. So let's say that we had our input coming in through channel 1 on our board, and these are the options I have currently with the setup I'm using for OBS. I actually have to switch out of this into a different way of doing things when I'm actually doing the real recordings and stuff. But anyways, these are my options here. So if I wanted to record an instrument, I would tell it to take the track from whichever channel my instrument or vocal or what have you was plugged into. And then I would want to output this to my master. All right, and I hope this is all making sense, but we're setting our inputs and outputs here just the way we would on an actual hardware desk or console mixing, whatever. once you have your signal coming in, you can then decide what to do with it from there. So a lot of boards will have some I say it a lot. Some boards will have built-in EQ or compression on their channels. Some don't. Whether you do or not doesn't really matter in this day and age, because you can do that in a DAW pretty easily. And then some boards will have aux tracks that you can use for various purposes. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. Actually, probably right now would be a good time. So we want to set up a send. So we'll create a new bus or aux track. They're basically the same thing in practice anyways. A bus or an aux are slightly different, but the way you can think of it is as a bus is something that you can send a group of tracks to that all come out of that bus. You can think of it as like if you have your kick drum, your snare drum, your toms, like your drum kit, you have each of them on individual tracks. So you have a track for your kick drum, you have a track for your snare, you have a track for your hi-hat and all that. Well, you can send them all to, if you think of each of those tracks as a person, you can send each of those people onto a bus, and then wherever the bus goes, all the people go with it, if that makes sense. So essentially, a bus is just a way to group several tracks together so that you can process them as a whole, as opposed to individual tracks. An aux track is somewhat similar. It's basically you're taking a copy of the signal, of the sound, what have you, and you're sending it somewhere else as well. So you have both the original track, and then you have a copy of that track also. It's almost like duplicating a track in a lot of senses, in all practical terms. So let's do this. Let's just really quickly put together a drum track, just super quick and easy. I'm not going to think too hard about this. We've gone over how you can do this kind of thing. We're going to just pick a track at random here. We'll name this drums. And then we're just going to put together a very basic drum track so that I can show you kind of how some of this this works out. Piano roll is what I'm looking for here. We don't need velocity, so sure. And I'm thinking we'll just do an eighth note thing here. Super easy. We're turning every other hi-hat down just to give it a little bit more realism. And then a snare on 2 and 4. You know what? I'm actually thinking with this particular set, let's just do snare on 3. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to think too hard about it. We're just going kind of for something simple here. But we've got this drum track going, right? And so what we can do is one of two things. We can either copy and paste this drum track to another track, or we can set up an aux track. And so if we were to set up an aux track, we would create an aux for it. And now what's happening on this track is also happening on this track. So if we solo this aux track, it's hearing exactly what this track is hearing. It's all the same. Everything is exactly the same. But now we can output this aux track to somewhere else if we want to. We can maybe throw some reverb or delay on this track. So if we were to say, throw this delay on it, rather reverb here. Now this drum track, we have the dry drum track, and then we have this reverb track. So if we listen to this reverb track, it's going to be very reverby. Right? And then if we listen to this track by itself, it's going to be just the dry track. Or it should be anyways. Oh, because it's outputted to aux1. Well, that's interesting. Another way to go about doing this, I've never actually tried using auxes in this, and I'm not 100% sure why it is operating the way it is. We'll delete this aux track, and we'll just send these drums to this patch point here. And this should do what I was trying to do with the other track. So we have just our dry drums here, and then we have our reverby drums here. And then when we play them both together, we have the combination of the dry drums with no reverb, and then nothing, and then just the full reverb drums here. And then all we need to do to turn down the reverb is turn down the volume of this drum reverb track. So we can just call this drum reverb. And then we can play with the settings. Now I'm going to do a video in the future going over the different effects, like your EQs, compressions, reverbs, delays, and modulations, and all the rest of that kind of stuff. I'm just trying to give you a quick idea of how routing works within the signal flow. So, for instance, how you would want to process it. And where this comes in useful is after you've done your recording. Like I said, signal flow has a lot to do with the engineering side of things, and not so much with the production side, but you can use it with the production side of things, because the signal flow will tell you how you want to route this signal. So for instance, if you did want to, say, put some reverb on this drum track, what's the best way to go about doing that? If you did want to compress and EQ this drum track, what's the best way about what's the best way to go about doing it? And so signal flow allows you to understand where this signal is going and how you're hearing it, right? So in here you have your, it says effects here. This is your insert section. An insert means that you're putting it, the signal is being inserted directly into something, and then it's going to be outputted from there. If we come back to our diagram here, maybe we can show that by saying that we have our signal, whatever that is, which apparently I can't spell. And then if we want to insert it into, say, an EQ, and then it's going to be outputted from that EQ, right? So our signal goes into the EQ and then out of the EQ. And so our whole signal is being processed by this EQ. And that is an insert. We're putting this EQ directly into the signal path of whatever it is that we want to EQ. And then maybe from there, we're putting it into a compressor. And then, you know, whatever else we want to put on this thing. Conversely, if we have our original signal and we have an aux track, our signal is actually, remember, an aux track is a copy of our original track, whatever that is. And then our aux track, then we can perhaps put, say, a reverb or a delay or something, but then that gets outputted as well. And then usually that reverb routes to back into your master track or a subgroup of some sort, a bus or what have you. Excuse me. We'll go into more of why you would want to use an insert over an aux or an aux over an insert in future videos. But I will say that generally speaking, and this is not always, but generally speaking, when it comes to reverbs and delays, you oftentimes want to route them to an aux or to a bus of some sort, as opposed to inserting them directly into the chain of your signal. And there's reasons for that we'll get into in the future, but once you kind of understand how things are working and running, you can start to get a little bit creative with it. So for instance, when it comes to inserts here, whatever you put in here first is going to be your first thing that the signal gets processed by. So I've put in an EQ here. So this drum track is running into this EQ first, and then maybe we have it running into a compressor next, and then maybe we have it running into some sort of like distortion or something after that, right? So it's being EQ'd first, then it's being compressed, and then it's being distorted. If I were to say put this distortion here, well, now it's being distorted first, then it's going to be EQ'd, and then it's going to be compressed. And you can put this in any order that you want. Sometimes it's best to have your distortion last. Sometimes it's best to have it first. Sometimes it's best to have your EQ first. Sometimes not. This becomes very subjective, and there's some people that will swear that you have to have a certain order of operations when it comes to effects. And there's nothing wrong with that because, you know, at the end of the day, whatever works. But for me, I find that sometimes it's fun to play around with things. So for instance, let's say that let's dig in here and maybe just try doing a little bit of EQ real quick on these drums. Nothing crazy. I'm just going to do a little bit of a smiley face kind of deal here, which I'm sure people will tell you to stay away from. So we'll turn everything off with this EQ, and here's without the EQ. Here's with it. Without it. All right. So you can kind of hear what this EQ is doing. I'm boosting a little bit of the low end a little bit and boosting a little bit of the high end. And then we're going to compress it some. The actual settings I'm using are not super important right now. You don't have to worry too much about it. We'll go into what EQ and compressors do and how they work in another video. But for now, I'm just kind of trying to give you a basic concept of how the order of operations can affect things. Okay, so that's feeling all right. And then let's distort it just for fun. Let's turn it on. That would probably make it easier to hear. But not with that distortion. Let's try something else. Maybe this guy. Okay. All right. So just a few different effects that we got going on here on this drum track. We've got an EQ, and so the signal, the drums are being fed into this EQ, and then they're being EQ'd and processed by this EQ, and then the output of that EQ is going into this compressor, and then it's being compressed, and then the output of the compressor is going into this distortion, and then this distortion is finally going to our master channel, and that's kind of what you're hearing. And so this is with everything on in this order: the EQ, compressor, and distortion. We'll do before and after. So this is with everything off. And then with everything on. All right, so now I'm going to play the track again, but this time I'm going to put the distortion before the EQ, and we'll see how that changes the sound. And it makes a big difference where you have this distortion, right? If I have it after everything, it sounds one way, and if I have it before everything, it sounds completely different, right? And that's because the order of operations matters. Whatever is first in this is the first thing that's being is what's happening first to it, and then on down the line, as many plugins as you want to put on. So maybe now let's put the compressor first and see how that changes. So we'll do before. And then we'll switch that EQ back. So yeah, no matter where I put these things in whatever order, it's changing how things sound. And so understanding how the signal is flowing through these effects can really create some big differences in the overall sound and how you're processing these drums. And then if we want to also then add in, say, a delay to these drums for whatever reason, just for fun. And I'm trying to use as many stock plugins as I can to show you that there's you don't need all the bells and whistles necessarily in order to create some fun effects and things like that. You can use a lot of stock plugins, and they're going to serve just as good as a lot of third-party stuff. Although third-party stuff is great too. I'm not trying to take anything away from that. But if you know how to use the tools, you can use them to great effect. So, anyways. And then we can maybe throw stereo. All right. And so, yeah, you can have some fun with that. And so I have my delay being fed in through the copy of the drums. So you have just the dry drums, or the drums that are processed with these effects, and then you have just the delayed signal. And here's what just the delayed signal sounds like. All right, and so when you combine the two together, Or you can, maybe give them some fun little grooves here. All right. And so you can have some fun and be creative and kind of play around with the different settings, play around with the order of how you have things going, and it's going to all affect how the overall processing is happening. And that's where you can kind of get creative with signal flow, is to understand how the signal is being run through these things, and then you can play with changing that signal flow. But once you understand sort of these basic concepts of assigning the inputs and outputs, well, here we've got the input going of this, the output of this signal going to the input of this EQ, the output of this EQ going into this compressor, the output of that compressor going into the distortion, and then the output of that distortion is what we're hearing in our track. And so understanding kind of how signal flow works, and you can get way more technical with it. There's way more about signal flow that I'm just not gonna. We're not going to get into here, because it's not super necessary in order to understand how to do this processing stuff. I really want to keep it as focused on the production side of things as I can. So unless you are planning on becoming a recording engineer, you don't need to know every single little thing about signal flow, but understanding the basics can help you become a little bit creative and can kind of help you understand how things are routed and ways to creatively use that routing in order to process your signals, process your sounds, and give them some interest, right? So I think we've touched on everything I want to touch on. We've gone over the basics of it, the AE1 Opium, your assigned input, output, preamp, monitor, and master, and the differences between what you're hearing here. Like, monitor is what you're hearing, master is what the computer is hearing. They're not always the same, nor do you want them to be the same. You want your master to get the most optimized signal, whereas monitor is, you just want to hear what you want to hear at the levels you want to hear it at. And so this monitor is more your personal subjective preference. Master, you're trying to give the computer the best signal that you can, and that does not always translate to a good listening experience, which is why we have a monitor and a master here. And you want to make sure that that they're set up properly so that you're hearing what you want to hear and the computer's hearing what it wants to hear. You want to make sure that you understand input and output and how that chain works so that you can get everything running and being connected the way you want it to do. And then once you understand the signal flow, you can start getting creative with it, using auxes, using buses, and understanding the order of operations as far as how your plugins work and how having them in different orders of operations can affect this signal in different ways. And feel free to play around with that. There's no, in my opinion, there's no set way that is the one way that you need to do this. Sometimes you want to have the distortion first. If that's giving you the sound that you want it to have, then great, that's the way to do it. Otherwise, you want to have it be the last thing. And if that's giving you the sound you want, great, do it that way. There's no wrong or right way, but understanding that moving these things around can have a serious impact on the sound that you're getting and how you want it to sound. So you can use these kind of things, these concepts to play around. Again, also, 9 times out of 10, you're generally speaking, just as a rule of thumb, but you don't have to necessarily do it this way, you want your reverbs and your delays to be on your aux channels or bus channels if you're going to be sending groups. So, like, let's say we had a drum track, a guitar track, a bass track, and a vocal track, and a synth track, and we have 8 tracks, and we want to send, and we want all of them to have some reverb on them. Well, we can just create a bus track down here that has our reverb. We'll set our output to master so that the signal is being put to here. And sometimes you might have a submaster, or you might have different groups. So like there's ways that you can use these inputs and outputs to tell this signal where you want it to go in order to process it the way you want it to be processed. But let's say that we had go back to our example, we had drums, guitar, bass, guitar, vocals, and all that kind of stuff. And we want to send all of it to one reverb. Well, we can output a copy of those, which we using a aux track in this case. So we're creating a send, which is essentially creating an aux track. And now these drums are being sent to this reverb down here. And then we can use this to control how much or how little of that reverb we want. All right, so you kind of get the idea here, how all this is functioning. And then we're having, at the end of the day, every signal will eventually end up on your master track. So, and if not, then you may not be hearing what you think you're hearing when you do your final bounces and things like that. So these are all things to be aware of, knowing what your inputs and outputs are, how you have them routed, where you want them to be going. This can all kind of have an effect on your productions, and understanding the basics of that can really open up some levels of creativity that you may not have previously been aware of as far as how to process sounds. And you can do this several times. Maybe you want to send these drums not to just a reverb, but maybe you also want to modulate them or something like that. And I'm just kind of arbitrarily choosing some stuff. I'm not saying that this is anything you would necessarily want to be doing to your drums. I will say EQ and compression are going to do 80 to 90% of all heavy lifting when it comes to like mixing or processing things. But you know, here's another example of something you could do maybe if you so desired. So we're going to also send our drums to some modulation. And we can control how much of that modulation we want applied to our signal with this fader here, our send fader. And you can also, you know, have this turning up and down as the song goes to kind of add interest over time if you want to do some automation on the drums. Same thing with the reverb or even the delay. You can have the delay turn up. So you can have that be, you know, on and off or turned up or down or whatever. So you can get creative with this once you understand how this signal flow works. Anyways, I hope this has all been helpful. I hope that you now have a better understanding of signal flow and how it can apply to your own productions and how you can use it in some creative ways in order to get the sounds you want. Next week, we're going to dig a little bit more into the effects. And so I might do, you know, a video on each of your main effects, such as like your EQ, your compressions, your reverbs, your delays, and do a specialized video on each of those components so that you can kind of understand how those are going to affect the sound of whatever you happen to be working on. Now, that gets into a little bit of mixing, but you know what? A lot of modern producers use a lot of these creative tools in order to get the sounds that they want to get. And so I think once you have an understanding of these tools, it'll help open up some more creative avenues on how you can get sounds to sound the way you want. And then after you have an understanding of that, we can even get into stuff like sound design. But before we get into sound design, you really need to understand some of the basic components of like EQs, compressors, and the signal flow of how things go, because sound design utilizes all of these concepts in order to create these sounds that you might want to begin to create. So anyways, hope this has all been helpful. I hope you guys have yourselves a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.